In the year 8 AD, the famous Roman poet Ovid was completely banished from society. He was exiled to the absolute edge of the known world, a freezing little town on the coast of the Black Sea. He had no libraries, he had no intellectual conversations, he had absolutely zero friends, he had nothing but pure terrifying silence, and the slow, miserable passing of days with no human contact. By every normal human measurement, this isolation should have destroyed him, and for Ovid it absolutely did. He spent his entire exile crying and writing desperate letters, begging the emperor to let him come home. He never recovered. He died in that freezing town, completely broken and forgotten by the empire he used to entertain. But here is what makes this story so fascinating. Right around that same era, a completely different kind of man was facing the exact same brutal conditions, total forced isolation from the world. But instead of crying, he came out of the dark harder and sharper and more powerful than he had ever been before. The difference between these two men was absolutely not natural talent. It was not a lucky break. It was one specific psychological secret that the ancient Stoics understood perfectly and that almost nobody in the modern world has ever been taught. I am going to reveal exactly what that secret is right now, because once you deeply understand it, sitting alone in a quiet room will absolutely never feel the same way again. Most normal people experience being alone as a terrible tragedy that is happening to them. They do not get invited to the big social event. Their long relationship suddenly ends. Their old friends slowly drift away. The season of their life completely changes, and suddenly they are spending way more time alone than they ever wanted to. And because they did not actively choose this isolation, it feels like a painful punishment. It feels like the empty room is screaming a terrible verdict about their actual worth as a human being. So what do? They aggressively fill the empty space. They fill it immediately and completely. The exact second the room gets quiet, they pull out their phone. They turn the television on in the background, not because they are actually watching a show, but because the pure silence just feels way too loud. Every single tiny gap in their day gets stuffed with cheap digital noise. Because the alternative of just sitting alone in a room with absolutely nothing but their own mind feels genuinely terrifying. But that deep discomfort is not a sign of weakness. It is highly valuable information. It is telling you something very dark and specific about the exact relationship you currently have with yourself. Seneca noticed this exact same sickness in Rome 2,000 years ago. He wrote that he never came back home with the exact same moral character he had when he left the house. He said something inside him always became totally unsettled when he left his quiet space. He was describing exactly what happens when a weak man completely relies on other people and loud external noise just to feel okay. The exact second the crowd goes home and the noise completely stops, the dark internal chaos that was always hiding inside him becomes totally impossible to ignore. Most average people spend their entire lives desperately managing that internal chaos by staying just busy enough to never have to look at it. And they actually call that living. The ancient leaders called it hiding like a coward. The ancient Stoics made one massive distinction that will completely change your reality the second you finally see it. They separated the feeling of loneliness from the power of solitude completely. They did not see them as two flavors of the exact same thing. They saw them as total opposite realities that just happened to wear the exact same physical disguise. Loneliness is sitting alone in a room and desperately wishing you were somewhere else. It is the painful experience of pure absence. It is the feeling that something massive is missing from your soul. It is the agonizing gap between where you physically are and where your ego wants to be socially. Loneliness makes you incredibly weak because it positions the outside world as the only magical source of everything you need to feel whole. Solitude is completely different. Solitude is sitting alone in a room and aggressively using that time as a weapon. It is the deliberate, violent choice to sit alone with your own dark thoughts without running away from what you find in the shadows. It is the powerful experience of absolute presence rather than pathetic absence. And it builds a titanium foundation inside your mind that no amount of loud social connection could ever build for you. Marcus Aurelius lived one of the most socially demanding and chaotic lives in all of human history. He was constantly surrounded by desperate people. He had military generals and greedy senators and complaining family members screaming in his ear every single day. The loud, deafening noise of running the empire absolutely never stopped, and yet he wrote something amazing in his diary. He said, "Nowhere on earth can a man find a more quiet or untroubled retreat than inside his own soul." He was not talking about running away to a cabin in the woods. He was describing an iron fortress he had physically built inside his own mind through years of deliberate, brutal solitude. He could access that quiet fortress even while standing in a room full of screaming politicians. That is exactly what real solitude builds. It does not just give you peace when you are physically locked in your bedroom. It builds a permanent peace that travels with you into the absolute worst chaos, because it lives deep inside your bones rather than depending on your external circumstances. But deeply understanding the difference between feeling lonely and using solitude is only the very first step. What solitude actually does to your brain when you finally stop running away from it is a terrifying secret that most people will never get to find out. And it is the exact reason why the most powerful and dangerous men in history almost always kept a brutal practice of forced isolation at the dead center of their lives. When you finally force yourself to stop filling the silence, something highly uncomfortable begins to happen. It does not feel peaceful at first. It actually feels terrible. The human brain that has been running on a toxic diet of cheap external dopamine does not just magically settle down the second you turn off the screen. The noise inside your head actually gets 10 times louder before it ever gets quiet. Old, painful conversations suddenly bubble up to the surface. Unresolved trauma that you aggressively buried under years of busy work comes completely back to life. The deep, creeping anxiety that your phone was keeping pushed down makes itself fully known. Most average people interpret this horrible feeling as absolute proof that being alone is bad for them. They tell themselves they are just not built for isolation. They say they are an extrovert, and they just need more social connection than other people to survive. So they immediately grab their phone and run right back into the cheap noise and the managed chaos of a life specifically designed to never be fully quiet. But the rare men who force themselves to stay in that burning room long enough always discover something incredible waiting on the other side of the pain. Absolute pure clarity. They discover a supreme quality of high-level thinking that is simply not available to a brain that is constantly processing garbage external input. It is the exact kind of clarity that lets you step outside of your own body and view your entire life from a cold, calculated distance. It lets you ask brutal, terrifying questions about what you are actually doing with your limited time on Earth. It forces you to ask if your current path is actually taking you toward your ultimate empire or just leading you off a cliff. Seneca wrote a command to his friends. He said, "You must retire into yourself as much as you possibly can." He was not telling them to become weird hermits and avoid human contact. He was giving them a direct military instruction to stop letting the presence of other people be the only thing standing between them and their own true identity. Look at the men and women throughout human history who produced the most dangerous original thinking, the ones who made the most terrifying and massive decisions, the ones who built empires that lasted for centuries. Almost every single one of them had a strict daily practice of total isolation, not because they hated society, because they deeply understood that the human brain only produces its absolute most lethal work when it is given totally uninterrupted time with itself. Marcus Aurelius wrote his legendary diary entirely alone. He did not write it to get famous. He wrote it to survive. Those dark, private hours of total solitary reflection produce psychological weapons that have shaped the greatest leaders for 2,000 years. He was absolutely not hiding from the world. He was going to a secret location where the world could not infect him so that he could come back to the battlefield 100 times more lethal than when he left. Here is the specific, terrifying kind of strength that forced solitude produces, and absolutely nothing else on earth can give it to you. It is the superhuman ability to become the absolute source of your own stability. Most normal people have a sense of happiness that is entirely, totally conditional. It completely depends on the people standing around them. It depends on being liked and included and constantly validated by the crowd. When all those warm, fuzzy things are present, they feel like a king. The exact second those things vanish, they feel a massive, gaping hole in their chest, and they start desperately performing tricks just to close the gap. A man who has spent real, brutal time entirely alone is completely different. A man who has sat alone in a dark room with his own mind without filling the silence with cheap noise develops a superpower. He faced the absolute worst discomfort his brain could throw at him, and he survived it. He develops the terrifying ability to feel completely okay, regardless of what the chaotic social environment around him is doing. He does not feel this way because he is a cold sociopath who hates people. He feels this way because his concrete foundation is simply not built on the shifting sand of other people's opinions. Epictetus said you must never demand that things happen exactly the way you want them to happen. You must demand that things happen exactly the way they naturally occur. That supreme level of internal dominance cannot be bought. The ability to be genuinely okay with total disaster, rather than constantly crying for things to be different, is only forged in the fires of solitude. It absolutely cannot be built anywhere else in the world, because everywhere else there is always some cheap external crutch for you to lean your weight on. Look at the man who can walk into a crowded room without needing a single drop of validation from anyone inside it. Look at the man who can sit at a dinner table where absolutely nobody is paying attention to him and feel completely, totally fine. Look at the guy who can spend an entire weekend completely isolated in his house without once feeling like his life is falling apart. That man is not disconnected. That man is an absolute weapon. He is totally free, and his massive freedom is visible in a specific way that weak people can physically feel before they can even put a name to it. Now take your mind all the way back to the beginning of this video. Think about Ovid sitting in his freezing exile and the unnamed Stoic master facing the exact same brutal conditions. They lived in the exact same cold external reality, but they had a completely, totally different internal experience. The difference was absolutely not the weather or their circumstances. The difference was whether being alone was a terrible tragedy happening to them or a massive opportunity they actually knew how to weaponize. Ovid absolutely never learned the lesson. He spent his entire painful exile crying and waiting to be magically rescued by the outside world, and he died miserable, still waiting for a ship that never came. The Stoic master walked out of his dark isolation 10 times more powerful and more himself than he had ever been in his entire life, because he spent that dark time in the absolute only place where his true powerful identity actually lived, deep inside, completely alone, with absolutely nothing to hide behind and zero cheap noise to hide from. That is absolutely not loneliness. That is the most dominant and terrifying place a human being can ever learn to stand. And the absolute only way you will ever get there is to finally stop running away from the quiet room long enough to find out exactly what kind of monster is waiting for you on the other side of it. If you are actually ready to stop acting like a victim and start weaponizing your own solitude, hit the like button right now. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never fall back into the trap of needing cheap external validation. And I want you to make a hard physical commitment right now. Go down to the comments and type the exact word solitude. Do not just think about it in your head. Make that single physical action your absolute permanent declaration that the days of running away from your own mind are officially over.